such immigrant who has filed a meritless, even a meritless application under the RPI program could hold up his removal for many years, maybe, well, many years, and before the denial of his application is truly final. The application would not be final until it went through both levels of administrative review at the department and district and circuit court review in the federal courts. So the bill actually encourages meritless applications because undocumented immigrants would have nothing to lose by filing them since they can't be removed until all levels of review are complete. In addition, the filing of a class action lawsuit throughout this country would create even more of a delay and interfere in the reasonable administration of the program. National class actions could be certified and prevent removal of immigrants throughout the country. This could impact any and all immigrants under the program and result in tying the system up in knots. The bill doesn't even require, now get this, the bill doesn't even require exhaustion of administrative remedies in order to file a class action lawsuit in the federal courts. Further, the bill creates broad judicial review of denials of current forms of relief that presently allow for very limited review. These include adjustments of status for marriage or employment, cancellation of removal, and criminal and fraud waiver. So why do we need to change current law? It already has some access to the courts, but why broaden?
First of all, I have 9 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They've been approved by the majority and the minority leaders, and I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Objection so ordered.
Thank you very much.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-954, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 73, S-954, a bill to reauthorize agricultural programs through 2018.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We are going to resume now discussion on the Farm Bill, and before doing that, I see one of the distinguished members of our committee on the floor who I know would like to make some other comments, and I just want to thank her in advance for her leadership. We are so excited and pleased to have the senator from North Dakota on the Agriculture Committee, having had a chance to be in North Dakota, and she's said to me 1,000 times, it's burned in my memory that 90% of the land in North Dakota is in agriculture. And so she reminds me of that every day. She has been a key person in helping us bring this farm bill to the floor. And so before proceeding on the Agriculture Reform, Food and Jobs Act, I would ask that Senator Heitkamp be recognized.
Mr. President,
Senator from North Dakota.
I'd ask that I be able to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
On the floor of the United States Senate, senators often come to praise the local university football team that just won a championship, or the famous coach who's retiring, or maybe even a famous politician who's passed away. Today I come to the floor of the United States Senate to thank a man that will never be written about in the history books, or even known outside of my small hometown of Manador, North Dakota. Brad Hebmonik's life and his accomplishments were pretty modest by national standards, but nevertheless, for the people of my small hometown, Brad was something special. Brad was a standout high school athlete, a veteran, a softball coach, a National Guardsman, a co-worker, a husband, a father, a gardener, and a friend. For most of his adult life, Brad was the mayor of Manador. Not exactly the most glamorous of jobs. Manador runs exclusively on volunteer labor. For years, he made sure that the city water and sewer were working, that the Christmas tree got decorated, that barking dogs were attended to, that the garbage got picked up, the roads got fixed, and abandoned lots did not get overrun with weeds or junk. For years, Brad got to do the great ceremonies incumbent on a small-town mayor. For example, after I was elected Attorney General of North Dakota, Brad presented me with the key to the city. Now, this was no ceremonial key. It was the real deal. And I wondered for months after getting that key what that key actually opened up, until one day I got a call from Brad asking me if I could send the key back. See, the key was actually to the town dump, and spring cleaning was coming, but that was Brad. You can't look anywhere in Manador and not see his impact. Go to the small ballpark, and you remember Brad organized the National Guard to come and clean out the old grove of trees. Look to the large VFW, and you remember Brad recruited folks to come help build it. Look to the fire hall, and you remember the games of pickup baseball we played when we were kids. Look to the Manador grade school, and you remember that Brad was a kid who always took the dare, the kid who always organized the pickup football games, and every kid in grade school knew the lyrics to the Marine Corps hymn over and over again because Brad made sure that at every choir practice we sang it not only once but twice. Men and women like Brad are the unsung heroes of our democracy. They step up and volunteer when their country and their community needs them. They are friends when a person needs a friend, and they never forget where they came from. So even though he will never have a chapter in a history book, he'll always have a place in the hearts of the people of Manador. And in my book, that's an honor unequaled. Thank you, Brad, for all you did for your country and our small town. Godspeed, my friend. I and all of Manador will miss you. Are we in a corner?
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I would ask unanimous consent that at 12 o'clock noon today, the Senate observe a moment of silence for the victims of the tornado in Oklahoma.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, just a few moments that we know we have other colleagues that will be coming to the floor to talk about the very, very important jobs bill, reform bill, food bill that we have in front of us, conservation bill as well. I just want to take a moment for our colleagues, first of all, to say if there are amendments that people have as we're moving through the bill, we're doing our best to finish this by the end of the week or certainly get as close as we can, and we are very interested in working with colleagues that have amendments and appreciate if they would let us know what they are and bring them down so we can be working with them on any amendments. We are very proud of the product that we have in front of the Senate right now. There are 16 million people that work in agriculture in this country. I'd say that's a jobs bill. I think it's probably the biggest jobs bill that we will have in front of the United States Senate. Agricultural jobs, both directly with those who are producing our food, who are producing the equipment for our food, who are doing all the pieces around food production and processing and the efforts in trade around the globe, where we are proud to say that agriculture is #1 in creating a trade surplus for our country. Other countries are looking to us. There are 7 billion mouths to feed in the world today. American agriculture is at the front of the line, feeding families, supporting efforts around the globe. We know that that number is growing every day, and the leadership of American agriculture is going to be even more important in that process. We also know that this is a bill that conserves our land and our water and our air, our forests. This is the piece of legislation that focuses on conservation for working lands, lands that are owned by someone in this country, which is the majority of land. And there are incredibly important partnership efforts that go on. The Farm Bill improves 1.9 million acres of fish and wildlife habitat. That's why our conservation title is supported by over 650 conservation and environmental groups all across the country. We have the same conservation title that we had last year, and I'm very pleased to say that the House has also adopted the structure of reform that we have in our bill. It's very, very similar to the House and Senate bills on conservation. And this is a real landmark piece of legislation as it relates to preserving our soil, our land, our water, our air, our forests, and it's a commitment that we make as Americans to future generations. We've also added in this legislation a commitment that was brought to us by the commodity farm groups and environmental and conservation groups to make sure that when farmers are using critically needed tools like crop insurance, which is the mainstay for farmers now, buying crop insurance and hoping that, in fact, they don't have to get a payout because it means they've had a loss or a disaster, but in having crop insurance, which is now the foundation of what we are doing to support farmers across the country, they have agreed to tie conservation practices, compliance for conservation, to crop insurance, which is a very, very important policy. It's a historic agreement between agricultural groups, conservation and environmental groups, and we have, as a result of their agreement and their urging, added that to this bill, which is a very significant increase, strengthening what we are already doing on conservation. We make a strong commitment to families on nutrition. We make sure that every family that currently qualifies for nutrition assistance in our country continues to receive that assistance. We create savings by looking at areas where there has been abuse or misuse by a few states on one policy and by individuals or retailers in other areas, and we tighten that up so that we have more integrity in the process and that we can make it clear that we stand with families who need help. We stand with families who find their own personal disaster because of the economy, just as we stand with farmers for a strong crop insurance program when a farmer has a disaster as well. But we do make sure that there is integrity in the programs, which is very important. We've had at least 2 cases in Michigan where people won the lottery and continued on food assistance. Pretty outrageous, Mr. President. And we make sure that that kind of thing cannot happen again. There's been abuse in other areas where retailers have allowed people to turn in their food assistance card for money to buy drugs or other illegal activities. We make sure we clamp down on that. We've gone through every part of the bill to address misuse, waste, fraud, abuse in every part of the farm programs, but certainly in this area as well, so that we can stand before you and say this is about making sure that folks who've worked all their lives, who've paid taxes all their lives, who suddenly find themselves through no fault of their own in a situation where they need some temporary food help, that they are able to get that for their family. The good news is those dollars, that part of the Farm Bill, is actually decreasing. The costs are going down. Not because we are cutting back on support for families, but because the economy is improving and more people are going back to work and they don't need the temporary help. That's the way we should be reducing the costs, and that's in fact what we do. I'm also very pleased with the fact that we focus on rural development and reforms there that are very significant and very important. Right now, Mr. President, there are actually 11 different definitions of the term rural. And we had local mayors and county supervisors and village presidents come in to us and say, we appreciate the fact that rural development funds allow us to provide financing for our businesses and water and sewer projects and housing projects and road projects, but could you just give us one definition? Rather than trying to figure out 11 different ways to define rural. So it may sound simple. It wasn't simple, Mr. President, but we've actually got that down to one definition. And we've streamlined the process and the paperwork so communities, small towns, folks that support and need rural development, economic development help can get that with a minimal amount of paperwork. We have done that through this entire bill. And frankly, I truly believe that if in every part of government we did what we have done in agricultural programs, we would not only be doing what the public wants, but we'd balance the budget. We have 100 different programs or authorizations we've eliminated because they didn't make sense anymore. They were duplication, not wise spending for taxpayers, things like direct subsidy payments to farmers that didn't make sense, cutting from 23 conservation programs to 13 and putting them in 4 different subject areas with a lot of flexibility so we can stretch out and get more bang for our buck and do a better job, and without in any way reducing the commitment to conservation. We've gone through the entire Farm Bill and made tough decisions, smart decisions. We've saved about $24 billion, more than even we did last year, while having a set of policies that are broadly supported in the conservation community, the agricultural community, the energy community, those who represent small towns across this country. And we did it again by making tough decisions and by working together on a bipartisan basis. I also want to say that I'm proud of the fact that even though through these arbitrary across-the-board cuts, in my judgment, that make no sense, called sequester, even though those cuts would require $6 billion in cuts in agricultural programs, we have been willing, voluntarily, to come up with 4 times the level of cuts and ask for your support for a set of policies that work better, that streamline the system, that cut back on things that don't make sense to do but strengthen the priorities of things that are important for economic growth, for families, for conservation, for communities all across this country. We are willing and have done our part, Mr. President, to step up and meet the challenges of deficit reduction, of balancing our federal budget, but keeping our commitment to our farmers and ranchers who have the riskiest job in the world. As I said yesterday, nobody else has to worry about when it's going to rain or not rain. Too much rain, not enough rain. Whether it's going to freeze like it did in northern Michigan after the cherry blossoms came on the trees and the freeze wiped everything out. Nobody else is in a business where they can't control the most important factor, which is the weather. And we have certainly seen the havoc that the weather has played on families across this country, including what happened yesterday in Oklahoma. So we stand here proudly to say that we support an effort that is creating reform, that's saving money, that's standing up for the folks that have helped create the most affordable and safest food supply in the world, America's farmers and ranchers. And we stand here supporting American families who need to make sure that when times are tough, that the very best of America's values are in place, which is to make sure that they have the ability to put food on the table for their families. At this point, Mr. President, I believe we have others that will be coming to the floor, and at the moment I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
As we know, the victims of the crimes committed by these individuals should be taken into account, and the peace of mind that they have perhaps begun to attain by the knowledge that their perpetrator of the crime is no longer in the country and can no longer do them harm. But this legislation would allow these criminals to return to the United States without further notice or consultation with the crime victim. That's deeply disrespectful of their rights, and it's insulting and potentially dangerous to the victims of crime. So my amendment would fix this flaw by requiring the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security to notify and consult with victims of any criminal alien that when they seek to re-enter the United States with legal status. My second-degree amendment makes a variety of clarifications to the amendment, which specifically clarifies that the Department of Homeland Security should work with prosecuting agencies to notify and consult with victims. It provides protections to those victims, ensuring that they do not suffer adverse immigration enforcement actions as a result of coming forward. That's similar to the protection, the T visa we provide to victims of human trafficking as they're cooperating with law enforcement authorities. Some groups have strangely characterized this amendment as a poison pill. It's baffling to me, but I'm comforted by the knowledge that the National Center for the Victims of Crime strongly supports this amendment, and I'd ask that this letter of support be made part of the record.
Without objection, it is part of the record. And so has the Senator modified his amendment? Is that my understanding? Or is about to?
We've offered a second-degree amendment. I understand, I'm told that it's acceptable to some members.
We're going to discuss that in just a moment, just so we'll know where we are. Without objection, the Senator's amendment is modified by his second-degree amendment. That's what is before us. I know Senator Klobuchar and others want to speak, and then I'm going to have a couple of comments to make. Senator Klobuchar.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand there's maybe one more modification, or it's already included in the second degree, but I wanted to say I appreciated the changes that have been made, and I support this amendment. I like the part about allowing the Homeland Security Secretary to have the information from victims. I think it can be very helpful in making a decision about whether any kind of a waiver should be granted. I think Senator Cornyn and I both come from prosecutor backgrounds. We understand the importance of input for victims in the system, and they should be every much as respected in this system. So I really appreciate this amendment. I think it's a good one, and I'm glad to support it.
Now I have a question of the senior senator from Texas. I understand that we're changing the victim notification period from 90 to 60 days. That modification is acceptable to me. And adding a sentence to clarify that if a victim cannot be found or does not respond within the time frame, the Secretary of DHS will proceed with the adjudication of the application, and that this would make implementation of the amendment more manageable. Am I correct in my understanding? Mr. Chairman's correct. Thank you. With those Mr. Chairman, modifications, I certainly would. I do not have objections, but I want to hear from others. Senator Durbin.
Mr. Chairman, let me add my voice to yours. I think the modifications really improved this amendment, and I'm planning on supporting it.
Thank you. Then
I was just going to say I strongly support the amendment. I think it continues what this committee has been doing historically to give victims certain basic rights, and it's important in that regard.
Senator from Arizona.
I just want to say I support the amendment. My predecessor, Senator Kyle, would be proud. This is an issue that he's worked with Senator Feinstein on for a long, long time, and it's a great amendment. Thanks for bringing it forward.
I was thinking exactly that. Same thing. I'm sorry.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to say to the senator from Arizona, he's absolutely correct. Senator Kyles was one of the leaders on this issue, crime victims' rights, during his time in the Senate. He made a big imprint on that area of the law, and I'm sure he would be proud of this improvement of the bill. Thank you.
Well, then, all those in favor of the Cornyn Amendment 4 as amended signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. And it is passed. And Senator Cornyn, did you have another amendment? Senator Cornyn, did you have another amendment?
We are back and forth to Finance Committee with the IRS investigation, so I'm
The
happy to
Democrats
now.
are all finished. We have a stack of amendments on the Republican side. I want to make sure they're all heard.
If you'll give me 60 seconds to collect my...
And just so people understand, we will do Senator Cornyn's amendment, and then Senator Lee has one or more amendments. Senator Cruz has amendments. Senator Flake has amendments. Senator, and I think
Chairman, I'm ready to, whenever you're ready. I'm ready whenever you're ready.
Go ahead, Senator Cornyn, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to call up Cornyn Amendment number 5, please, and ask for its immediate consideration.
Thank you.
Cornyn 5 is before us.
This amendment deals with national security and public safety. We all believe we must create a fair and workable immigration system, and we also need to make sure that law enforcement has the tools they need to protect the United States and deter and detect and deter fraud. As we found out on 9/11, the failure to share information can have lethal consequences and damage, of course, our national security in the process. Under the current bill, the Department of Homeland Security officials would be prohibited from sharing critical information contained in the application of illegal immigrants who petition for legal status, even if that information reveals critical evidence of terrorist or criminal activity. In other words, the language in the underlying bill would prevent the Department of Homeland Security from sharing information with national security and law enforcement agencies. We know that in 1986, the Simpson-Mazzoli legislation, that similar prohibitions on law enforcement information sharing prevented officials from pursuing investigations of many serious criminal offenses. And I may be wrong, but I think I remember the senator from New York's comments in the New York Times some time ago about that being one of the mistakes that was in Simpson-Mazzoli and which resulted in rampant fraud in the implementation of that legislation. But to put it bluntly, the current ban on law enforcement information sharing is harmful to public safety. But there's an easy way to fix it. My amendment would provide legitimate confidentiality while allowing the Department of Homeland Security to share critical national security and law enforcement information contained in these rejected applications once all administrative appeals for the particular application have been exhausted. In other words, after the application's run its course and all appeals exhausted, then that information sharing would kick in. It would allow the Department of Homeland Security to share information contained in an RPI application that is requested by other law enforcement agencies as part of an investigation of a violation of the laws of the United States. In other words, my amendment would give DHS officials the tools to both proactively and reactively prevent terrorist attacks and crimes. This amendment is modeled after the confidentiality provisions in the Violence Against Women Act, which allows the government to share and use information submitted in an application. Quote, when the application for relief is denied and all opportunities for appeal of that denial have been exhausted, close quote. I would ask my colleagues if this confidentiality provision is good enough for the protection of victims of crimes against women. Why isn't good enough for an illegal immigrant who's simply out of status? This amendment would not discourage any eligible immigrant from coming forward and applying for legal status because it would only apply where a law enforcement agency has already begun an investigation or the application in question has been denied with all administrative appeals exhausted. So there's no need for confidentiality at the stage covered by the amendment. The immigrant's application would already have been denied. The immigrant would therefore have already come forward. This amendment does not undercut the compromise or overall structure of the Gang of Eight plan. It simply makes it workable and eliminates and deters both violations of the law and fraud. It protects the American people in a common sense and straightforward way. And so if we're serious about learning the lessons that the ranking member and others have so articulately argued that we do from the 1986 bill, learning those lessons of 9/11 and improving the bill, then we should guarantee that law enforcement has the tools it needs to rule out fraudsters, criminals, human traffickers, and terrorists to make sure they don't benefit from the legislation. Finally, my amendment would also give the State Department more flexibility to share foreign visa records with our allies. We do this by clarifying that the State Department may share visa records with a foreign government on a case-by-case basis for the purpose of determining removability or eligibility for a visa, admission, or other immigration benefits, not just crime prevention, investigation, and punishment, or when the sharing is in the U.S. national interest. So I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting this amendment.
I'm going to vote for this.
Thank you. I think others wish to speak. I'm just worried that you move that confidentiality. You have a lot of people who don't know whether they're eligible for citizenship or not. They come in at the first thing they're told, whatever you say can be used against you, in effect. That has a chilling effect. Law enforcement has a lot of ways to find things. I'm not sure this is the best place to do it. We have a number of areas where, of course, there are confidentiality for priest, penitent, doctor, patient, and so on. But I am not convinced of the need of it. But let me...
May I clarify one point, Mr. Chairman, in light of your comments? I want to make clear that the confidentiality would be removed if the application is denied, not if the application is granted, and only after any appeals from the denial of the application are concluded. So there in no way will this operate to the prejudice of the individual in terms of their application for RPI status. What it would do is allow the information to be shared with law enforcement for the purpose of rooting out fraud and any law enforcement or national security threats. Thank you.
Senator Durbin.
If the Senator would yield, I followed your argument, and I think the point you just made is an important one. This only deals with RPI denial cases. You have made your argument based on questions of law enforcement and national security, which I think is a compelling argument. But I think your amendment goes further, because your amendment also authorizes civil actions. My question to you is this. Let's assume I've been in the United States for 12 years, and I'm applying for RPI status. I've worked at many different jobs. I've used Social Security numbers that may not exist, or maybe they weren't even asked for. Now, to prove my presence in the United States and qualification for RPI, I disclose my employers, the people who hired me, who incidentally may not have paid me minimum wage or anything at all. So the question is the disclosure of this information now going to be used against prior employers of those undocumented in the United States as to whether or not they have violated the law in the amount of money they paid me, the conditions of my work, or whether they filed the proper I-9 as required by law? So are you opening up civil and criminal actions against the employers of undocumented people?
I don't believe so. That's certainly not the intent. It would be available when law enforcement attempts to subpoena the information. It'd be subject to the standards that ordinarily prevail when it comes to a subpoena that might be served for the information. The basic point is, in 1986, there was massive fraud associated with that amnesty provision, and what we're trying to do is avoid that going forward without prejudicing the rights given under this legislation to people who apply for provisional status. So the whole purpose is to root out fraud, to identify criminal conduct or national security threats.
And I think you have a strong argument there. But look at page 2. Look at your paragraph 3. It talks about a duly authorized investigation of a civil violation, and it refers to that in the remainder of your amendment. You've gone beyond law enforcement and national security. And I think in so doing, you've opened this door that perhaps those who employed the undocumented are now going to be subject to civil, criminal liability. If that's not your intent, I think it needs to be changed.
I would say that's not the intent. The language, I believe, is clear that it applies only to civil actions brought by the government, in other words, by a law enforcement agency, not private lawsuits.
If you haven't paid the minimum wage as an employer, is that a civil action by the government?
I
think it is.
Given the massive amount of work that the federal government and its agencies are going to have to do to implement this law, I can't imagine that law enforcement agencies are going to be running down those kind of rabbit trails. That's certainly not the intent.
I wish you would tighten up the language. It would, I think, be a better amendment.
Senator Cornyn, a question. It seems to me that what he was saying is, in reference to Senator Durbin's comment, that if an investigation is ongoing involving an employer who violated labor laws, and a subpoena or request was made, this could be made available. That makes perfectly good sense to me. I don't know why this information should be kept secret if it proves an employer who's violated the law and being investigated, why this information shouldn't be made available. But as I understand the amendment, it doesn't suggest you should go through these RPI records to investigate employers. They seem to applying only if employer was independently under investigation.
I would tell the senator from Alabama that his reading of this is correct. That's certainly the intention. This really does not contemplate that there are going to be investigations of RPI applications per se, but if there's an ongoing civil or criminal investigation by the government or other authorities into fraud, criminal law violations, or national security threats, that this not be maintained secret, and that it be available for a lawfully issued subpoena to get that information as part of another investigation.
Senator Cornyn, isn't it just put on your hat as a former Justice of the Texas Supreme Court, isn't it fundamental that we need to be very careful when we make any suggestion in law that a person is free to tell the government false stories and provide false documents for our benefit, and then we're going to seal those records and documents, and you can and never going to investigate it, and you're just absolutely home free to do that? That would be a danger, would it not?
I agree. It's to maintain the confidentiality of these applications for all purposes would be an invitation for fraud and corruption and potentially dangerous to the public safety and the national security of the United States. That's why I believe the amendment is well taken.
Anybody else wish to speak? Senator, wish a roll call vote on this?
I'd like a roll call vote, yes, sir.
Thank you. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Feinstein.
Aye.
Mr. Stewart.
No.
Mr. Durbin.
No.
Mr. Whitehouse.
No, my proxy.
Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Franklin.
No, my proxy.
Mr. Coons.
No, my proxy.
Mr. Blumenthal.
No.
Ms. Corona.
No.
Mr. Braxton.
Aye.
Mr. Hatch.
Aye, my proxy.
Mr. Sessions.
Aye.
Mr. Grant.
Aye.
Mr. Cornyn.
Aye.
Mr. Lee.
Aye.
Mr. Cruz.
Aye, my proxy.
Mr. Clayton.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
No, and Senator Whitehouse, no in person.
Mr. Chairman, the votes are 9 yeas, 9 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. The next we have Senator Lee, you have an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to call the Lee Amendment number 10.
Lee Amendment number 10 is before us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill is purported to require applicants for legal status to pay back taxes as a condition of achieving legal status. But the bill, upon closer inspection, requires those immigrants applying for legal status to pay only those back taxes that have already been, quote-unquote, assessed, such that if an immigrant has worked illegally in the United States for, let's say, 10 years, and the IRS has no tax records for that immigrant, then this bill would, by my reading, not require the immigrant to pay any back taxes at all. Lee Amendment number 10 amends the definition of applicable tax liability in the bill at pages 70 and 71 of the bill to include not just taxes assessed, but any taxes owed regardless of whether they have previously been assessed by the IRS. We have a responsibility, I think, to inform the public about what the bill actually requires of those being given legal status. And if an immigrant has worked illegally for 10 years in the United States, under the table or perhaps under a false identity, there's no requirement in the bill that such worker pay those back taxes. An RPI applicant must pay only those taxes that have actually been assessed, and this amendment would close that loophole. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, normally I'd be concerned that this is really in the jurisdiction of the Finance Committee, but if Senator Hatch were here as a ranking member, we could ask him.
Michigan.
I would ask to call the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that following the moment of silence at noon today, the Senate proceed to a vote in relation to Cantwell 919, that upon disposition of the Cantwell Amendment, Senator Gillibrand be recognized.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And let me also indicate, Mr. President, we are also working on a Sessions Amendment 945, which we had hoped to line up as well. And I understand there's an additional modification being made. If that modification is agreeable to both sides, it's our intention to adopt that amendment as modified prior to the caucus meetings. I would suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Call upon be terminated.
Without objection. Under the previous order, there will now be a moment of silence for the victims of the tornadoes in Oklahoma. Under the previous order, the question occurs on Amendment 919, offered by the Senator from Washington, Ms. Cantwell. Senator from Michigan.
Madam President, let me just indicate that this amendment would require that tribes be included in the development of Resource Conservation Act appraisals. It's something that is supported by Senator Cochran and myself. I would ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp. Aye. Thank you. Mr. Heller. Ms. Herrano. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Donnelly, Enzi, Heitkamp, Murray, Reed of Nevada, Schatz, and Stabenow. Mr. Corker? Aye. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. Cowan? Mr. Cowan? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mrs. Boxer? Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Scott. Oh, not ready yet. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Cornyn? No. Mr. Nelson? Mr. Nelson? Aye. Mr. Franken? Mr. Franken? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester? Aye. Mr. Pryor? Aye. Mr. Cruz? Mr. Cruz? No. Ms. Warren? Ms. Warren? Aye. Mr. Johans? Mr. Johans? Aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Crapo? Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Blunt? Aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? Aye. Mr. Merkley? Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mr. Kirk? No. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown? Aye. Mr. Manchin? Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall of Colorado? Aye. Mr. Durbin? Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mr. Burr? Mr. Burr? Aye. Mr. Casey? Mr. Casey? Aye. Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Mr. Barrasso? Mr. Barrasso? Aye. Mr. Blumenthal? Mr. Blumenthal? Aye. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman? Aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin? No. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee? No. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley? Aye. Mr. Begich? Mr. Begich? Aye. Mr. Isaacson? Mr. Isaacson? Aye. Mr. Leahy? Mr. Leahy? Aye. I didn't get him. Mrs. Gillibrand? Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Yes, yes, yes. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Yes, sir, I do. Yeah.